was Cirque de Serpico by Daniel Howard. I don't know. It's been 2 months since we've done this.
Nice. I like it. Welcome to I'll Drink to Fact, a true story versus Hollywood podcast where we talk about your favorite true story movies and compare them to the facts of the actual cases or stories or real life events, whatever it may be.
Paranormal happenings.
And we flesh it out and see what's going on. If it's true, if it's not, if it's full of shit.
Get fleshy.
And yeah, we get fleshy with it.
Oh. No. Oh, this smells so good. What's in your cup?
What's in my cup is actually a can. It's a can of Irish Channel Stout by Nola Brewing. And it is very, very, very tasty. It feels more like a porter to me than a stout, which is probably why I like it so much. But it's good stuff. What is in your cup over there? Or should I say glass bottle?
In my glass bottle, I have a Neapolitan milk stout from Sagatuck Brewing Company out in Michigan. And I opened it and it smelled like strawberries. And it's delicious. It's super smooth.
May I have a
not
taste,
too sweet.
please?
Nope.
Damn. That is not bad. That is exactly what a Neapolitan stout I think should taste like.
That's awesome.
That is awesome. It reminds me of when I was a kid and my parents...
all the beers you drank when you were a kid?
Yeah, all the beers. You know how we do in the
South.
South.
All the milk stouts I drank when I was a young child.
No, when I was a kid, my dad used to always get Neapolitan ice cream by Bluebell. And so it reminded me of, just that. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I also had Neapolitan ice cream a lot when I was a kid, so it's delicious. I'd highly recommend it.
So, as Katie mentioned, we have not been here in a little while, which has been rough on us. We've been wanting to get back to this. We've been wanting to get back to you guys and gals and serve up some more episodes. We've got some really good feedback from everybody, and it's been a long time coming trying to get back into the studio to get this going, but we are many, many miles away from where we were.
It's all my fault. I got a new job.
No, not her.
Across the country.
It's okay. We moved from Texas to Wisconsin, so we're coming to you from Wisconsin now, up in the Midwest.
Yeah. Back to where I'm from, but it's a new experience for Daniel, but we had snow our first week here, which is pretty much on par for what you get in Wisconsin.
And it was more snow than we ever get where I'm from in Texas. So, like, if it snowed that much in Texas, people would be losing their shit. I mean, like, there would be, like, so many accidents on the road and everything. And
oh, no doubt.
Yeah, It is what it is. So,
but in Wisconsin, it was business as usual. So.
Exactly, yeah. So, we are back. We're happy to be back. Yes, it feels like it's taken us forever to actually get in here to get this done. But we're going to pick up where we left off. We told you Serpico was coming next, so that's what we've got for you today, is the story of Serpico and the real-life story of Frank Serpico.
I also kind of blame this movie for us taking so long to get back into recording, because it was hard. It was hard to get through that movie sometimes.
It's all right. It is a classic. The first half of it seems a little bit slow in relation to the second half of it.
Yeah, we'll get into it.
But... it is definitely a classic, and Pacino's Pacino. So, so that's where we're at. We have many episodes planned to come back to you guys. That way, hopefully, we don't have to take a break like we just had. But we wanted to get completely settled in and give you full, accurate episodes and not half-ass it. So, that's why it took us so long. So, Katie did the movie this week, Serpico. What can you tell us about the Sidney Lumet classic?
Can you do an Al Pacino impression?
Can you tell us about the fucking movie? Sorry, that's about as good as it gets. I was sitting over here, and I was drinking my beer. And then I was wondering, when is he gonna fucking do the movie?
That was awesome.
Oh, that was horrible.
Oh, and on that note, that was awesome. Good job. Thank you. So the movie Serpico, starring obviously Al Pacino, that was released in 1973. The runtime is 2 hours and 10 minutes, so a hefty movie. It was adapted from Peter Moss's biography of Frank Serpico, and that covers the years of about 1960 to 1972. So that was one thing I thought that was really interesting, was like literally the story was finishing up, and they made the movie and got it released the next year. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it was pretty wild, especially with what I'll get into with the like actual information. Like things were literally wrapping up in like 1972. It's not like, you know, the bulk of the story happened in the 70s and then there was time to write it. And no, I mean, like, shit happened. Shit went down in 72.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Probably unpopular opinion. I really did not like this movie. I found it really slow. But, I mean, obviously, it's like you said, it's a classic movie. I think Rotten Tomatoes gave it a 90%. Mabel doesn't like the movie either. Mabel has an opinion as well. But I mean, it was an Oscar-nominated movie. I don't think it actually won any Oscars. It was Oscar-nominated for Best Actor, Best Lead Actor, and then nominated for Best Writing Screenplay based on material from another medium, so based on that book. And I mean, Al Pacino was that year, just to give you an idea of what the Oscar nominees looked like for Best Actor, Leading Actor. Al Pacino was up against Jack Nicholson, Robert Redford, Marlon Brando, and he ultimately lost out to Jack Lemmon, who was in Save the Tiger, which I'm not familiar with that movie. But, I mean, obviously there were a lot of good actors nominated that year, so not surprised Pacino didn't win, but that's kind of what the movie was up against. And it didn't even win Best Screenplay based on material from another medium, though. So
That's interesting.
Oh, you know what? I think I remember now. Do you know what did win Best Writing Screenplay based on material from another medium?
No.
Pretty sure Poltergeist won that year.
Really?
Yeah.
That's great.
Which we will probably do. I hope we'll do it. No, not Poltergeist. The Exorcist.
Okay.
It was The Exorcist, which we will also probably do.
It is The Exorcist. Which The Exorcist also looks like won Best Sound.
Oh, I have that in my notes, The Exorcist. Just kidding, guys. Okay, so I think that's all I have for kind of introductory information. Now I'll get into the movie synopsis. So really, like I said, this movie was kind of slow. So the first hour and a half of this movie I thought was really slow. So here's my hot take synopsis for the first hour and a half of this movie is that cops take bribes from criminals, and some cops skim extra off the top of these bribes for themselves. And then Serpico doesn't take any money, but he receives a lot of pressure to take the bribes. There. That's my synopsis of the first hour and a half of this movie.
It's pretty accurate.
Okay, no, but really. The movie opens up in kind of like a Quentin Tarantino kind of way where Al Pacino, playing Frank Serpico, is in the back of a cop car, and he's got blood all over his face. He's breathing heavily and struggling to stay awake. And then we cut to the police station and see other cops being notified that Serpico has been shot, and no one seems very surprised or concerned. And when one cop asks his boss if he thinks that another cop did it, he says, "I know 6 cops who say they'd like to." So we get the impression that Frank Serpico is not a popular guy among the police force.
Not at all.
No. So we see Serpico get taken into the hospital on a gurney, and they start prepping him. Then we cut back to Serpico's graduation from the police academy, and they're kind of cutting back and forth between like him in the hospital and him on his graduation day from the police academy. And at the end of that, we see that Serpico starts as a patrolman in the 82nd precinct, I believe. Obviously, all this taking place in New York City, Brooklyn, the Bronx. I don't know how all that works.
One of the boroughs. New York City has 5 boroughs. So, what? Brooklyn, Bronx, Manhattan, Queens, and Long Island, I think.
Sure. I don't know.
Never been, so.
Yeah, me neither.
Speculating.
All right, someone can let us know how that works. So we see Serpico kind of walking into the police station. He's looking at things on the wall, and one of them is like Patrolman of the Month. He sees the person's picture, and it turns out to be his partner. And so one thing, just to kind of get an impression of what's going on with the police, So Serpico and his partner, who is patrolman of the month, they get lunch at the deli counter. And the guy behind the counter says, hey, how about the cream chicken today? And Serpico says, no, I'll take some of the Italian beef. And then when they sit down, Serpico looks at his food and sees that it's like all fat. And he says that he saw some nice lean beef up there. And so he wants to go get some better beef.
A better cut of meat.
Yeah. And his partner says to him, don't complain. It's free. And Serpico says, well, why can't I just pay for it and get what I want? So that's just kind of like an example of like one of the ways in which cops are kind of getting paid off. They get bribes in multiple ways, and Serpico just kind of not going along with it. Another example of this is, and just throughout the beginning of the movie, there are just kind of like more and more examples of this, just like cops kind of like not doing their jobs well, and Serpico kind of being like, hey, let's do our job the right way. Like, for example, Serpico was out on patrol and they heard a call come through on the radio, and Serpico says, oh, we're like right near it. Like, let's go answer that call. And his partner says, no, it's not. It's technically not in our sector, so we're going to ignore it. But Serpico takes the call anyway. And it turns out that it's a woman being raped by a group of men. So Serpico chases down and tackles one of the men and takes him down to the station. When the man's taken in for questioning, the interrogator beats him, and Serpico... he asks Serpico if he wants to participate in it. And Serpico says, no, I'll go fill out the arrest card, leaving this other police officer to basically beat the perpetrator. So in the next scene, we see Serpico pulling the beaten man aside, and he says he wants to buy him a cup of coffee. And there he convinces him to turn over the name of the other guys that were involved in the rape. Serpico tracks them down and finds them playing basketball, at like a park. And he phones into the station calling for backup, because there are two guys there and there's only one of him. And the detective he talks to refused to send backup because the detective who was on the case is out for a couple of days. So Serpico says, well, they're here now. Like, I have to arrest them now. And, the police officer on the other end of the phone says, no, we can't do that, blah, blah, blah. So Serpico just ends up arresting both of them by himself. When he's booking the men in the police station, the detective who didn't want to send backup, he comes over and says, I'll finish up the paperwork since it's not going to count as Serpico's arrest anyway. And he said the reason why is that if they credit the arrest to Serpico, he'll get in trouble because Serpico's the one who left his post and he entered a public park without prior approval and other bullshit such as that. Another thing I really didn't like about this movie was that there really was no indicator of how much time had passed other than the length of Serpico's hair.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Facial hair in the movie. So in like one scene we see Serpico with a mustache, and in the movie he started with no facial hair. So he slowly grows facial hair over time. But anyways, we see him sitting in the police station, and the speaker up front mentions something about a fingerprint identification course coming up that's required in order to get into the BCI, which is the Bureau of Criminal Identification, and that being a member of this bureau is a step in the career path towards getting a detective's gold shield. And so that kind of becomes, I guess, the main thing that Serpico is working in his career towards is this detective's gold shield. So his, ears kind of perk up. And in the next scene, his mustache is a little bushier and his hair's a little shaggier and he has thicker sideburns. So I guess that means more time has passed. And we learned that he is in the BCI now. So whatever time is necessary in order to be a member of the BCI is how long has passed since. Let's see. I don't know. So one day, Serpico sits down with his captain and he requests a transfer. He says that it's been 2 years since he's been in the BCI. So we kind of get little glimpses of how much time has passed. But it hasn't gotten him any closer to being a detective. So he says that he doesn't want to go back to being a uniform officer. He wants to be a plainclothes officer. So he gets transferred to another station as a plainclothes patrolman, which I think is like the 93rd precinct or something like that. As soon as he checks in, he gets crap about his appearance,
Right, because he looks like a full-on hippie at this point.
Right. One of the officers says that he looks like an asshole with dentures. He's got so much hair on his face.
Like, so much hair. He's, like, wearing, like, a poncho and stuff.
Mm-hmm. But he convinces his boss to let him keep his look so that he can better blend in on the streets. So, fair enough.
Which is important if you're going to be a plain close cop.
Right. But it kind of gets him into trouble because later, as he's chasing down a perpetrator, backup uniformed police officers arrive, but the officers start shooting at Serpico because they don't recognize him as a police officer. The officers are apologetic, and they ask Serpico if they can get credit for the arrest instead of him so that it doesn't look as bad that they were shooting at him and don't have anything to show. So now at least they have like a reason, I guess, to be shooting at this other officer was because they ended up getting an arrest out of it. So once again, Serpico's kind of screwed out of getting his arrest, which I don't know if that counts to anything. Like numbers, quotas, I don't know if that's...
I don't know if quotas were such a big thing back then. Part of what I'll get into is talking about years later on quotas. But yeah, I feel like they just wanted some sort of justification for like discharging their weapon.
Right.
And honestly, if Serpico just wanted to like uphold the law and protect it, like...
It shouldn't matter.
It shouldn't matter who gets credit for it.
Right.
I understand he definitely doesn't want like a corrupt cop to get credit for it because then it looks like they're like excelling at their job when they're really not. But, you know.
And I think that's the reason why he didn't really like fight them on it. Because like this has happened multiple times in the movies where the cops are like, oh, give me credit for your arrest. And he's just kind of like, okay, whatever. Because I think just because of that, because he's more...
he's worried about solving, or, you know, like stopping the crime.
Yeah, the job of a police officer.
Which if, you know, somebody else is booking, that's more time he can actually be on the street stopping something.
There you go. So then there's this sort of meeting, and it appears to be like cops from multiple precincts. This is the one in the movie where they're passing around the joints so that cops know what marijuana smells like.
Right.
But he meets another detective named Bob Blair. Bob Blair? Did I say that weirdly?
Bob Blair?
Bob Blair.
Bob Man.
No. And Serpico finds out that he is a Gold Shield detective. So Serpico asks him if he kind of starts asking him about his career path. You know, he asks if he did 4 years in plainclothes, which apparently is a requirement to be a detective. But Blair replies no, quote, because he knows people.
Which shows the politics of, you know, what was going on.
Exactly. So one full beard and bucket hat later, an officer comes up to Serpico and says, you know, I've been holding this for you. It's from Jewish Max. So it's a white envelope with $300 in it. Serpico takes it home and he calls his buddy Bob Blair and tells him about it. Blair says that they can open a can of worms with this, meaning, you know, start a lot of
shit,
yeah, telling people about these bribes. And Serpico says that he really wants to make sure that he protects himself in this because he's the one who's going to be stepping up and basically ratting everyone out. Blair says that they can take it to Inspector Kellogg, who is the second highest ranking cop in the Department of Investigations. Blair says Serpico can trust him because Kellogg's is the most honest cop that he knows and owes him a favor. So again, kind of those like politics. We don't really understand, or we don't really get to find out what he owes him a favor for, but it's just kind of there. So Blair and Serpico meet with Kellogg, and, you know, he says, oh, this kind of thing was common in the old days, and that he's surprised it's still going on. And he says Serpico has two options. He says you can force me to take it to the Commissioner of Investigations, and he'll drag you in front of a grand jury. But this puts Serpico at risk for ratting everyone out, and he'll likely end up dead. Or the other option is just to forget about it. Basically
silence through fear.
Right. And again, this is, you know, Blair says, like, this is the most honest cop I know. And it's like, this is how he handles it. So Serpico returns the envelope to his partner, who says he'll give it to the Benevolent Association, which that's like, isn't that like a police charity or something?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a labor union, or it's the name of several labor unions representing police officers. But I mean, chances are that the guy probably just kept it for himself. So Serpico went back to his boss and requested another transfer because of all the bribes he was witnessing that the precinct was receiving. And Serpico said that he wanted to be transferred to another precinct where he didn't have to deal with bribes. So Serpico gets transferred to the 7th Division, which he is told is, quote, as clean as a hound's tooth. And so, of course, like Serpico's like first day in the new precinct, or at least what appears to be his first day, he's with another officer, and the first thing they do is like pick up a bribe from someone who was, doing some illegal gambling or something like that. And of course, when the officer offers Serpico a share, he refuses to accept it. Again, this is just kind of like the ongoing theme of the first hour and a half of the movie. So Serpico eventually gets partnered up with this guy named Don Rubello, who is like the worst person for Serpico to get partnered up with, because he is what they call one of the bagmen, which is basically the person who picks up the bribes and then distributes it out to the other officers. So Serpico is kind of working with the point man who's taking all the bribes. And, again, after, Rubello talks to Serpico and tells him, you should take money, you should take a share, it's looking bad, you should take the money. Rubello just kind of like flat out, he asks Serpico if he wants in on a cut of the bribe money. So once again, Serpico refuses, and Rubello says that he'll hold on to his share for him if he ever changes his mind. And that's kind of the end of that. So one day, Serpico meets Captain McLean, and he tells Serpico that he has gone to Commissioner Delaney and told him everything that Serpico has been telling him. So I think at one point, Captain McLean was Serpico's boss, and so he's already kind of known about these bribes for a while. And, he finally says that, all right, I've gone to the commissioner and told him everything that you know. But instead of transferring him, the Commissioner Delaney wants Serpico to stay where he is and to continue collecting information. So when Serpico asks when he can expect to hear back from the commissioner, McLean kind of gives him the old, don't call us, we'll call you. Wait for the commissioner to contact you, don't do anything. So, of course, that doesn't really put Serpico at ease, because he's in this awkward position of, like, knowing that the cops take bribes and that he doesn't take bribes. So it's kind of like a red flag to everyone around him. And he just doesn't feel very safe working in the department around all these cops that have guns.
He shouldn't.
Then Serpico is notified that Rubello had to be transferred, and they don't really explain why. But now he'll be working with the new bagman, Al Sarno. And again, I don't understand why they keep partnering up Serpico, of all people, with the bagman, but that's...
Maybe they're hoping that being like so involved in the actual actions of taking the bribes and handling it, he'll eventually just kind of like roll over and play along. Right. And part of the research I was doing that we'll get into that.
Okay. So, Serpico's starting to get kind of antsy. It's been weeks and he still hasn't heard anything from the commissioner. So he calls McLean back, and who basically tells him, again, just kind of like stick it out, to keep waiting and do not go to Delaney yourself. Like, just wait for him to contact you. So after Serpico gets off the phone with McLean, he says to Blair, who was kind of sitting there the whole time, that McLean is out and that nothing is going to get done from the inside. He says the cops at the top have been at the top for too long. So Blair suggests that they go straight to the mayor. Sorry, that was my...
Right to the mayor.
There you go. And that's because Blair knows someone. He knows the mayor's right-hand man, Jerry Berman. And so Serpico agrees to go straight to the mayor. It just reminds me of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia with Charlie.
This is for the mayor.
And how does doesn't he spell it?
Mayor, like a female horse.
Yeah. Oh. So anyway, Blair and Serpico go to Berman, and he is just blown away by the information, and he seems genuinely surprised to hear it. He even goes so far as to call the mayor while Serpico and Blair are sitting there, and that makes Serpico very happy. He feels like something's actually getting done about it, and kind of starts celebrating. And it's kind of funny because then cut to the next scene, which is Berman saying, "I could not be any more embarrassed." So apparently the mayor has not considered this case a priority, and the mayor does not want to alienate the police force. And, Berman gives some bullshit excuse that, maybe they can try again in the fall because they're expecting like these really hot summers and are expecting a lot of riots. So that's why the mayor doesn't want to alienate the police force, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And of course, this pisses Serpico off, and he turns against Bob Blair. So Blair says, oh, I know another guy we can go to. I know a guy at the Times. And now Serpico's like, kind of like, we've tried all this. We've tried going through your channels of, I know this guy. And all it's doing is putting my name out there even more and associating me with this. So Serpico tells Blair to fuck off. Those are his words. Okay. So now this is kind of when I felt the movie started getting good. So that's kind of like the first hour and a half of the movie.
All right.
So finally, Serpico decides to go to the other plainclothes police officers. And he tells them what Rubella was doing. So Rubella was basically holding a share for Serpico just in case he changed his mind. But then Rubella got transferred and the money went with him. So, of course, this kind of like turns the other officer, not really turns the other officers against each other, but obviously that pisses them off. And so they say, all right, we have to do away with like this bagman system. Everyone is responsible for collecting their own bribes. And then the officers start offering to pay back that money that Rubello took for Serpico to Serpico. So they're offering to Serpico, hey, we'll give you the money that you're owed. And Serpico's like, no. But they all keep pushing him. And again, they bring up, this will look really bad. You're looking really fishy that you're not willing to take any money. And they're like, well, don't you want any money for, your expenses? And finally, Serpico's like, all right, I'll take money for my expenses. So Serpico meets up with McLean and tells him, that he's done. He can't take any more of this waiting for Commissioner Delaney to get back to him. And McLean plays it off like he's surprised that the commissioner hasn't gotten back to Serpico yet. And this is when Serpico reveals that, quote, he's gone to outside agencies. And, that really angers McLean. Like, he doesn't want this information getting out. He says we wash our own laundry here. Like, we take care of our own problems. We don't need them getting out. And so he tells Serpico to stay away from outside agencies and just wait until McLean gets back to him. And Serpico says he's been waiting over a year and a half. So again, we have a little idea of how much time has passed. So he's kind of been waiting, sitting on this for a year and a half. And then in the next scene, I just kind of laugh because how I said I was like telling time by how long like Serpico's facial hair was and everything.
Right, yeah.
In the next scene, he's like dressed up as a rabbi. So he has like this super long beard on. And like my first instinct was, oh my God, how much time has passed? And then he like takes off the beard and it's like, oh. Anyway. One of his street costumes.
12 years ago.
Right? So anyway, Serpico gets pulled into a room where he's talking with Inspector Palmer, Inspector Daly, and Inspector Gilbert. So Palmer says that McLean contacted him and informed him of Serpico's allegations about the bribes and everything. And the first question he asks is why Serpico didn't come directly to them. So we're not really introduced to who these men are, but I think Palmer works directly like with the precinct, like in the precinct that Serpico works in. And so he's basically asking Serpico why he went over his head and went to McLean instead of coming directly to him.
Okay, see, I just kind of assumed they were like IAD, like internal affairs or something like that.
I think the other two men were.
Okay.
Like Gilbert and...
I say, like, not a lot is, like...
Daly.
Told to you, like, what's going on,
No.
But maybe that was to, just kind of show what he was working with is, who do I trust, Like, maybe it was, the names of these offices don't really make a difference when there's so many corrupt cops.
Right.
That, maybe, I don't know. It's one of those things when you're looking back on a director's choices and trying to decide why he did them, and it could have just been simply the fact that he didn't want to fucking put a name on there. Maybe it was an extra $20 to make an IAD, like, nameplate or something. And now we're, like, giving him a credit for, like, oh, he was,
it was
trying
super
to
deep.
Yeah, he was trying to describe what Frank Serpico was going on
trying
in
to
the
immerse
moment
you
by
in the
not,
situation.
Like, yeah, exactly.
So Serpico's response is that when McLean first asked him about the precinct, Palmer is the one who said it was as clean as a hound's tooth. So,
which I looked as a Southern idiom that basically just means it's free of corruption.
Oh.
It's clean.
As a hound's tooth.
Right.
All the Southern idioms they're using up in the Bronx.
Right.
So I guess one thing we are told is that Inspector Gilbert had come from the Commissioner's Bureau of Investigations. So Serpico says, oh, then you must have already heard about this situation. Commissioner Delaney has known about this since the beginning because I had McLean go to him and tell him everything. And Gilbert says, no, I haven't heard a word of it. So Gilbert asks Serpico if he would cooperate with an internal investigation. And Serpico says, well, I'll have to think about it. And then the men ask, like, what is there to think about? And Serpico says that he doesn't think that the division can investigate itself, which, fair enough.
Seems fair, yeah.
Then they ask if he would cooperate with an impartial investigation. And he says up to a point, just so long as I don't have to be involved. And Serpico says he just wants to go somewhere where he can just do his job. So, good cop. In the next scene, the three men are meeting with Commissioner Delaney, and he asks them if, based on what they know, if they think an investigation is warranted. And they say yes, and he says, well, then go do it. And then the three of them say, well, shouldn't headquarters handle something like this? And the commissioner says no, because they're experienced men, which I took as no, you're grown adults. Right. Yeah. Do it yourself.
Yeah.
As they get up to leave, Gilbert says to the commissioner, Serpico claims that McLean talked to the commissioner, about this whole thing a while back. And then the commissioner says, oh, yeah, I seem to remember something about that. And he just kind of leaves it at that. So again, just kind of showing how high up the corruption goes.
Right.
The commissioner knew about it and isn't doing anything until he's kind of forced to. So in the next scene, the three inspectors are working with Serpico and trying to figure out how they can set up an investigation and deciding how and where they can do surveillance. So in the next scene, we see Serpico in the locker room at the police station, kind of getting badgered by his fellow officers. And they even push him up against some lockers and pat him down. And then in the next scene, of course, the three inspectors are asking Serpico to wear a wire. And he says, they're patting me down every day. How am I supposed to wear a wire? He also says that if he wears a wire, he's going to have to testify in court in order to corroborate the tape. And he refuses to testify. So there's no point in him wearing a wire. So eventually Serpico is convinced that if he wants to get the indictments, he's going to have to testify. So now around this point, they get the DA involved, DA Tauber, and Serpico really wants to go after the top brass, the bosses, because they kind of knew about this situation without doing anything. As we saw with the commissioner not doing anything, McLean not doing anything. But the DA says that they can't go after them because they really don't have sufficient evidence, which Serpico thinks is bullshit, but Tauber calms him down by telling him that he should relax because there's, a Detective Gold shield in it for him, which again has kind of been that thing that he's been chasing after his whole career, or at least that's the way they make it seem. But Serpico replies to that sarcastically saying, yeah, that's what this has been about. I should just take my gold shield and forget about it, because that's not what this is about. Serpico says now he's a marked man and he's worried, about being in the department. And Tauber tells him not to worry because he's already arranged a transfer for Serpico. So of course, on his first day at the new precinct, or at least what we believe is the first day, the other officers are saying that they know that Serpico is involved in the investigation. And one of the officers pulls a knife on him and threatens him by saying, we know how to handle guys like you. And then Serpico responds by tackling him and pulling his gun on him. So all the officers kind of back off.
Whoa, guy, you're good.
So Serpico introduces himself to his new boss, Inspector Lombardo. Lombardo says that it'll be nice for him to have an officer that he can actually trust. So it kind of sounds like he knows that stuff is going on in the department. And he asks Serpico if there's anyone in the precinct that he would like to work with. And Serpico responds with, well, it's not really who I want to work with. It's who wants to work with me, especially after his introduction. So Lombardo offers to work with him if none of the officers want to work with him. And so guess who's working with Serpico now? Lombardo, because no one wants to work with him. So Serpico and Lombardo go out on a bust to what I assume is kind of an illegal gambling ring. That seems to be kind of the major busts that they're doing throughout this movie. And when the guy who's running the ring comes out, of his office, he hears the commotion of them busting in and he comes to see what's going on. He says, who are you? Who are you with? And Serpico tells them that they're police officers and that they're with the 8th precinct or whatever. And the guy says, no, you can't be with the borough. I just paid the borough off this morning. And of course, Lombardo, the inspector comes over and asks, who he paid off, gets the information from him and goes to his chief, who I kind of assume is his boss, and tells him what they found out. And apparently the payoff ring at this precinct is much larger and much more complicated than the one where Serpico came from, because in this precinct, the pickups are made by retired police officers, so none of the plainclothes officers are directly involved. And after finding this out, the police chief is kind of not useful. He doesn't offer any help, but it's kind of figure it out yourselves. So Serpico finally decides to reach back out to his old friend Bob Blair and tells him that he's finally ready to go to the Times. Serpico says that he wants to get his information out on the record just in case anything happens to him. Blair is worried that the two of them alone won't carry much weight for the times, so Serpico suggests that they get Inspector Lombardo to go with them. Lombardo agrees to go, and they get their story published in the New York Times. After the story comes out, Lombardo tells Serpico that Serpico has been transferred to narcotics in Brooklyn South. Lombardo says that it's clear that Serpico was transferred to narcotics because it's easy to get hurt and to get set up. So he just kind of says, be careful after everything that's going on. So after he's been transferred, Serpico gets pulled into another plainclothes officer's car. The officer pats him down, checks him for a wire, and informs him that they're working with much larger sums of money down there. He said that some officers are pulling in around $40,000 compared to the $800 that Serpico was used to hearing about in the other precincts.
That's crazy.
Yeah. He was saying, a lot of times it'd be 4 officers would split $120,000. And it's just Jesus Christ, how much money is moving through these officers? But, just kind of to intimidate Serpico and let him know, you don't mess around with those large sums of money. So, next, Serpico goes on a bust with 3 other officers, and Serpico watches these 2 men buy heroin from an apartment. So he grabs 2 other officers to help him kind of catch the drug dealer. And he goes to the door and, attempts to buy drugs in the same way that he just observed these other 2 men doing it. When the dealer enters the door, Serpico kind of rushes the door, but he gets caught between the wall and the drug dealer pushing the door closed on him. And so he can't reach. He's got his gun out, but he can't maneuver it to shoot the dealer. And so he's yelling at the other 2 officers to help him, but they just kind of stand there not doing anything. And finally, someone in the drug dealer's apartment pulls a gun and shoots Serpico in the face. So it must have been a smaller gauge, a 22 or something, because there's just a small little hole in his left cheek.
One thing I thought that the movie did good, because there, I'm sure, was speculation revolving the around the shooting,
right,
on whether the cops wanted him shot or not. Mm-hmm. One thing I thought the movie did well was to the actors that played the 2 cops that weren't moving, to me, appeared more frozen, kind of in shock or fear, than unwillingness to help. Which I don't know, I just think it was a smart part. It almost took a non-stance on it, not necessarily accusing anyone, but not accusing anyone.
Exactly. Yeah, because it could have been interpreted as shock or fear, or just kind of or maybe really even doing this? Anticipation almost, just waiting for it to happen. How long do we wait? I don't know. I
thought it was a really good shot.
It was
because of that reason.
Yeah, definitely a really good climax to the movie. Oh shit, and you're oh my god, is he gonna die? What's gonna happen? And then they kind of leave him there because they have to go after the drug dealer. So that's kind of a good excuse for them to leave him laying there and not necessarily help. I mean, again, to your point, did they run off and leave him there so that he would die, or at least they have the excuse of, we had to go after the drug dealer, So.
Maybe I can answer a few questions here when I tell you the real story.
Oh.
Shit.
Okay. Well, anyway, so then now we're all caught up to where the movie started. So we go back to the hospital. We see Serpico's parents meeting with Serpico's doctor, and we learn that the bullet did not enter his brain or his spinal cord, and his condition is critical but stable. So while in the hospital, Serpico finds out that he has earned, finally, his detective's gold shield. To which Serpico says, what is this for being an honest cop or being stupid enough to get shot in the face? So, needless to say, he did not accept the badge. Once he's out of the hospital, we see him testifying at a hearing for what I assume is the Knapp Commission. You can probably correct me on that. So he basically says that the biggest thing that can come out of these hearings is for changes to the department so other officers do not have to feel the same anxiety and frustration that he felt in trying to report this corruption. So at the end of the movie, the following script rolls onto the screen. It says, Frank Serpico resigned from the police department on June 15th, 1972. So again, a year before the movie came out. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for conspicuous bravery in action. Serpico is now living somewhere in Switzerland. And that's the movie. That's it.
Can I throw in some interesting facts I just found?
Please do.
Yeah, so this is actually an article by Mental Floss. You can look it up if you want to read the whole article. I'm just going to point out a couple of things. It's called 17 Incorruptible Facts About Serpico. One, it talks about, because you were talking about like the facial hair and all the like hair growth and everything.
Yeah.
So that wasn't a wig. That was apparently Al Pacino's real hair and facial hair and stuff.
Nice.
So the film was actually filmed in reverse order, so it could be trimmed before like the scenes where he had less hair, you know.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thought that was kind of interesting. It says there were 107 speaking parts, and it was filmed in 104 locations.
Holy shit.
So lots of all over the place. Sidney Lumet used every part of New York City, every borough except for Staten Island. So apparently Staten Island is a borough.
Okay. See, and that was one thing that, I mean, that was kind of I feel kind of lame saying this, but like one thing that was kind of hard to follow was like how many different people there were and who Serpico was going to. And so that's why I'm kind of glad I did the movie portion of it, to watch it again and like keep track of like who all the players were, because, but I mean, that's probably, I mean, you'll tell us, but I mean, I'm sure that's kind of the feel of how it worked in real life, is that there were so many people involved. It wasn't just, you know, one person, you know what I mean?
And then the last one that I found interesting here was Sidney Lumet shot this in 4 fully operational station houses without any problems. Apparently there were 2 officers assigned directly to the movie, and they actively helped once they realized Serpico was going for like authenticity.
Okay.
The thing I find most interesting about it is because we're talking about how soon after all this happened.
Yeah.
You know, so he shot in 4 houses or 4 police stations where people were fully aware of what went down.
And might have even been involved in what was going down.
Exactly.
That's crazy.
It's insane. So, I don't know. I just, like I said, found this article by Mental Floss, which I like as a magazine, but if you want to look up this article, it points out a lot of other things about like Dino De Laurentiis, who was one of the producers, how much he paid for the script, and other people who could have been in the movie and stuff. So very cool little article. So let's get in to the actual details, or what I could find of actual details.
Please do. Because
there are not a lot of details available out there from like what happened when he was a plainclothes officer and things like that. There's not, I mean, there's like general beliefs, but there's no, you know, he showed up to Station House 319 wearing a poncho and, you know. So, so the book that the screenplay is based upon, did the book just kind of cover like the... I didn't look into the book because I didn't know how closely related the book and the screenplay were. Okay. And I didn't want to pull facts from the book, and then it turns out like they weren't completely, you know, I didn't know if it was a complete, like an actual documentary or what the case.
Okay.
Biography.
Okay.
So, Frank Serpico was actually born Francesco Vincent Serpico to Italian immigrant parents. It showed that Frank had dual citizenship.
Okay.
In Italy and America, even though he was born in America. So I don't know if later in life or how he got dual citizenship.
I think there's a thing, if one or both of your parents are born in that country, you can get citizenship. Because I think I knew someone who, her father was born in England, and she's a dual citizen with England and America.
Okay.
So.
Cool. Okay. Well, there we go. He was born April 14th, 1936 in Brooklyn, New York. So at the age of 17, Frank Serpico enlisted in the U.S. Army. He spent 2 years stationed in South Korea. Afterwards, he attended Brooklyn College and worked as a part-time private investigator while attending college.
Oh, interesting.
On September 11th, 1959... Serpico joined the New York Police Department as a probationary patrolman and became a full patrolman on March 5th, 1960.
Okay. So, I mean, he went to the police academy, though, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure. So he was assigned to the 81st Precinct, which you said 82nd. So
My bad. I also
No,
put
it's
a
all
question mark after. The movie could have been right. I was like, 82? Because that's the other thing. It's like he gets transferred a lot. So.
A lot, yeah. And I don't put all the transfers in here. So he was assigned to the 81st Precinct and then worked for the BCI, as you said, it was the Bureau of Criminal Identification for 2 years.
Okay. I also guessed on that acronym because I think I called it the Bureau of Criminal Investigations. But
Nice.
Yep. My bad. Oh, no, you said identification?
Identification.
I said identification. Just kidding. Got that one.
He was finally assigned to work plainclothes, where he uncovered widespread corruption. Serpico just wanted to do his job, which was to uphold the law and protect the public. He loved being a cop and he loved public service, which made it hard for him to witness and accept corruption and the abuse of power that he saw every day in work. So during his time as a plainclothes officer, he worked in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Manhattan with a main goal of exposing vice racketeering.
Which is what those bribes. Is that the fancy name for the bribes?
Right.
Okay.
So vice means basically it's a vice squad in the police whose focus is stopping like public crimes like gambling, narcotics, prostitution, and illegal sales of alcohol.
Oh,
so they're the ones that work with things that would be vices, I guess. Like gambling, alcohol, drugs, sex.
Is that really where the name comes from?
It's gotta be. That's the only thing that makes sense. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but... and then crimes of racketeering, or examples of racketeering crimes, are extortion, money laundering, loan sharking, and obstruction of justice and bribery.
Okay. So is it kind of meta? Like he was working for a group that like...
should be stopping bribing.
Right?
And they were accepting bribing.
Yes. And then they're accepting... Okay.
Yeah. But they're also in the most... They're in the most advantageous place to accept those bribes because they're the ones that should be going, hey, what are you doing over there? Oh, we'll take that.
Right. You know, because there's just so much money being passed around.
So, that was his main personal goal, is exposing vice racketeering. Serpico didn't immediately report the corruption that he saw. Unlike it's kind of displayed in the movie or portrayed in the movie, it seems as like he almost immediately was just like, hey, these fucking guys, you know, like...
Yeah. Did it say how long it went on before he like finally said anything, or will you get to it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So for a while, his partner took Serpico's share of the payoffs, so Serpico could be left alone to do his job. But much like in the movie, the other officers around him eventually found this arrangement unacceptable and became increasingly suspicious about Serpico, which pushed Serpico to act because it literally became a matter of life and death. Like, you know, they're like, hey, we can't trust you, and we really don't want you around us if, you know. So in 1967, so we're talking 7 years after he became a full-on patrolman, 7 years later, he reported credible evidence of widespread systematic police corruption. However, nothing happened. And then he met another police officer named David Dirk, who would finally help him see results, which I assume is who was Blair in the movie, right?
David Dirk, Bob Blair.
Yep. Nice alliteration. Mm-hmm. Almost sounds like a comic, like a lot of
Lex
Luthor, Peter Parker, you know,
Lois Lane, Bruce Wayne. Okay, Bruce Banner.
Bruce Banner. There you go. Diana Prince. No, Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman.
So anyway, Serpico believed his partners were aware of his secret meetings with the police investigators that he started seeing.
Which, I mean, they kind of like... I feel like they kind of did that in the movie, too, because it kind of seemed like they were, like, talking about it, but it was like, I don't think anything had come out yet, because I think the first thing that really came out that, like, Serpico had kind of come forward was the Times article, and that wasn't until, like, way later in the movie. But
right. Which, anyway. So over the next 3 years, Serpico would be, like, terrorized and threatened about, like, you know, whether he was, you know, wearing a wire, if he was, like, investigating them, all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. So finally, he contributed to an April 25th, 1970 New York Times front page story on widespread corruption in the New York Police Department, which drew national attention. So I actually took some excerpts from that article. I was able to find it online, a digitized version of it.
Cool.
So the first excerpt I have here says the policemen and private citizens who talked to the Times. So let me preface this. Actually, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, did it actually like publish their names?
So that's what I was about to say.
Okay.
Like in the April article, because there was actually 2 articles.
Okay.
In the April article, it did not publish their names.
Okay.
And actually made a point to say that the people who came to us will not be named.
Okay.
So the first article here, the policemen and private citizens who talked to the Times describe a situation in which payoffs by gamblers to policemen are almost commonplace, in which some policemen accept bribes from narcotics dealers, in which businessmen throughout the city are subjected to extortion to cover up infractions of law, and in which internal payoffs among policemen seem to have become institutionalized. So commonplace. And there's a quote by a gentleman named Ralph Salerno. It says, police officials always talk about the occasional rotten apple in the barrel when corruption comes up, but if they were a lot more honest, they would talk about the rotten barrel, not just the single
shit.
apple. And Ralph Salerno was a recently retired New York police sergeant and nationally respected expert on organized crime.
Okay. You don't think that was that like a expert that they went to, or was that supposed to be like Inspector Lombardo?
It didn't really say. So the second article I got here, it says Arnold G. Fryman, now a state Supreme Court justice and until January 1969, head of the city's investigation department, who he did go to, refused to look into charges that Bronx gamblers were paying policemen between $800 and $1,000 a month.
Jeez.
Mr. Fryman learned about the case during a 3-hour conversation with 2 policemen, Serpico and David Dirk, in his Park Avenue apartment on May 30th, 1968. So 2 years before this article came out.
Okay.
And just about a year later, with no known assistance from the investigation department, 8 of the plainclothes men whom Mr. Fryman had been told about were indicted as a result of an independent investigation by a Bronx grand jury. So the investigative department never looked into these people. However, another an independent investigation into them found all these results, and they were indicted, which does not look good for him.
No.
Even though he went on to become a state Supreme Court justice. Next article, it says Jay Kriegel, Mayor Lindsay's staff assistant for law enforcement, told a policeman early in 1968 that the administration could not act on charges of police corruption because it did not want to upset the police during the possibly turbulent summer ahead, which was in the movie.
Yep. The guy that Blair knew in the mayor's office. Right,
exactly. Which I found funny that they never mentioned the mayor's name in that movie.
That's true.
Yeah,
they just say the mayor.
And yeah. So about a year before making the statement, Mr. Kriegel arranged for Mayor Lindsay to meet a group of policemen so he could get a realistic understanding of the problem of corruption. However, the meeting was called off at the last moment with urgent instructions from Mr. Kriegel to the policemen assisting him to forget that it had ever even been scheduled.
Oh, shit.
So there was, that going on, whether it was actual corruption or just the unwillingness to look into the corruption, which in itself could be corruption.
Right.
So I have another article here. Sorry, I've got a few different articles, but it was hard to find information detailing what was going on, so I felt like this would kind of shine a little bit of light on what they were seeing. So a detective with many years of experience in the narcotics division said one of his colleagues had arranged payoffs to the police from major heroin dealers of up to $50,000.
Wow.
In return for such favors as the destruction of evidence gathered on secret wiretaps. So that's major bribery and hiding evidence, obstruction of justice.
Major crimes, yes.
Yeah. And heroin, it's...
So it's kind of funny because when I was watching the movie, I'm like, wow, $40,000 and 4 men splitting $120,000. Those must be exaggerations. But no, you're saying up to $50,000.
Yeah, and that's for the favor of getting rid of that information. That's not
in exchange for committing a crime yourself.
Yeah. And it says because the detective arranging the payoffs was shot under mysterious circumstances a few months ago in 1970, he is now under investigation. So, and then one more from that April article. It says another aspect emerged in the anger of a Brooklyn bookmaker who complained that the plainclothes officers he regularly bribed continued to demand payments even after they had been transferred out of gambling enforcement to their narcotics division. So these officers who were accepting money when they worked in gambling to be quiet about the gambling were transferred to another division and still came back and they're like, hey, where's our payoff, you know? It's just kinda,
how dare they take advantage of these criminals?
Right? What the hell? So he said his payment was $1,200 a month divided by 4 levels of the department, including 1 unit at headquarters. Which, I mean, not to make it seem shady, but I mean, I don't know how he would know where his money's going if, you know.
Like the criminal would know.
Right. If somebody's showing up and they're like, hey, it's $1,200 this month, and he's like, oh, well, who all's getting that? And they're just like, we've got narcotics.
I mean, maybe though, like maybe they're like, oh, don't worry, your money's going to good use. It's going all the way up to headquarters. Like I could see that as like a reassurance thing. Like, okay, this is what your money, like maybe to justify the high cost. Because I could see him coming back and being like, there's no way I'm paying you $1,200 a month. If they're like, well, that $1,200 a month is paying you like all the way up through headquarters.
Right. Like, why was it $800 and now it's $1,200? And he's like, well, it's $800 because we're doing $200 at each of these departments, but now headquarters involved, so it's another $400.
Sure. Yeah.
That makes sense. And the bookmaker also said in an interview that some of his busier colleagues paid the police as much as $2,400 a month, and that the police imposed an extra payment if a bookmaker took bets on both the flat races and the trotters. Which I looked up, and trotters are the horse races that have a harness and the little 2-wheel cart behind them with the guy, and then flat races are the ones with just the jockey on the horse.
Hold on, Ken, if you're listening, I think we just had this conversation. I think we just had that conversation with my stepdad with like, what is it called when they put the little 2-wheel cart behind the jockey? It's called trotters, Ken. Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting. It made them pay a little bit extra if they took bets on both types of races.
That's funny.
And then, like I said, there was another article 3 months later in the June 1970 article, or 2 months if you use normal people's math. And in it, I took out just 2 articles that I wanted to point out. This one, they actually did put Serpico and Dirk's name in, which is kind of interesting that it's only 2 months later. So the first article says, for Patrolman Serpico, the disillusionment really set in when he found out that policemen often had to fight to get their desk officers to book prisoners. At other times, he insisted the desk officers would try to get them to book an innocent man. And always, he said he could not stand the daily corruptions, the policemen taking envelopes of money from the gambler, the narcotic pusher, the businessman who did not want to be harassed. So I pointed this one out because I felt like these things were actually fleshed out in the movie to the point of like the kid being involved in the rape, being beat, you know, trying to get something out of him. Whenever Serpico brings in the pimp, the businessman, and they're like, oh, we don't arrest him, you know, and he's like, no, I'll fucking book him myself, you know, and all this. And
I didn't mention that in the synopsis because I didn't really think that it had an effect on like the storyline. But yeah, there was like a businessman that the cops were like all buddy with, and like Serpico brought him in to be arrested, and like instead of like putting him in a holding cell like the other criminals, they had him like sitting in the office. They were like drinking coffee, like smoking and like laughing around, and Serpico's like, what are you doing? This is my prisoner, like he should be in the holding cell. And they're like, no, he's cool. And Serpico's like, no, he's a prisoner. And then like he gets into this whole brawl with the guy and like strips him down. Well, not like strips him down, but I honestly thought Serpico was going to rape him in this scene. But he like throws him in the holding cell and like flips out, and the other officers are kind of like, whoa, like calm down, man. And then Serpico's starting to write up the report, and then another officer comes in. He's like, hey, I brought the background check or whatever you call it, the rap sheet for this guy you just brought in. And Serpico looks at it and he was like, yeah, that friend of yours, like he's a cop killer and you didn't want to book him. Like,
yeah. So I didn't think that you could angrily put paper into a typewriter. But somehow he pulls that shit off. Like, I was like, whoa. Like, if he did that in front of me, I'd be like, yeah, I might piss myself. So. It's like one of those things, like, what was it, the Dane Cook joke about slamming the flap on a tent? Like, when you're pissed. No, I think it was Mitch Hedberg or something. Okay. You couldn't get pissed off in a tent because it's hard to, like, slam the flap. Like, when you do zipper it up real fast, like,
it's like trying to, like, angrily hang up a cell phone.
Yeah,
like.
Exactly. So anyway, yeah. So this one reminded me of that because, you know, that's one of the businessmen who didn't want to be harassed, and, you know, he usually paid off the cops. And Serpico was like, no, not today.
Yeah.
So the second article was says both Patrolman Serpico and Detective Dirk have said there was a reluctance on the part of police and city officials, even within Mayor Lindsay's office, to fight corruption in the police department. And as word swept through the department that a plainclothes patrolman and a detective sergeant were embarked on a campaign to do something about corruption, other policemen started talking to them. And once Sergeant Dirk said his life was threatened by an officer at the police pistol range. Another time, Patrolman Serpico said a policeman stuck a gun in his stomach and warned him that he would be killed. Patrolman Serpico recalled that a fellow policeman once said that he had never had any money and now was his big chance. And he said, "I don't care what they offer me, $1,000, $100, $2, I'll take it." To which Serpico replied, "My God, you're making $10,000 a year. You could never make this on the outside doing any kind of work. You know, you have a family, kids." And he said, then we came to a time when we sort of got locked in a delicate moment. I said, "Think about it." And the guy said, "If I did, I'd blow my brains out."
Well, and I mean, you say that they make, because I was kind of wondering about that, like how much money a year that they make. So $10,000 a year. Because I keep thinking about that. Those cops that are pulling in like $50,000, and I'm like, first of all, that's like 1970s money. That's just in bribe, and that's 1970s money. So like whatever that inflation, like whatever the equivalent is today, and I was like, that is so much more than their salary. Like they're pulling it in on like one-offs or whatever, and like yeah, you just said it's like 5 times their salary.
Right.
And so one thing in the movie that I didn't really talk about was when Rubello got transferred and he was working with Sarno. And you had mentioned like, oh, they must be pairing Serpico up with the bagmen to kind of help maybe convince him to start taking the bribes, because Sarno kind of was playing off to Serpico. You know, he showed him a picture. He's like, "This is my family. Like, if I didn't take these bribes, like, where would my family be?" Or he was kind of like justifying it, like, you know, he was taking the money for his family. So kind of like playing to, you know, pulling on Serpico's heartstrings, like,
right,
don't turn us in, like, that there's real people affected by this type of a thing.
And it, to me, this particular article kind of showed one, the like lengths that some of these police officers would go to protect this income.
Yeah,
you know, like we're willing to kill other officers, which is like, I mean, that's like the crazy. Biggest. I would feel, I've never been a police officer, but I'd feel like that's one of the biggest police officer code. It's a brother code, you know. As much as police officers don't like fire department, you know, fire guys are all brothers, you know, like I feel like when you're in that sort of workplace, like you rely on your
you're guarding each other.
Sorry, I don't mean to make it like gender specific, but you know, you rely on your family in that situation,
like literally life or death situations, like
right. And for them to be like, you know, like, nah, this fucking money comes first, I'll straight up kill you, is crazy. And then it also shows the, like, desperation in this one officer saying, like, I don't care what they offer me, $1,000, $102, I'll take it. You know, feeling that, like he needs it. It's almost like his crack, you know, or whatever the case. It's now become an addiction for him, you know. And then the final comment there, you know, is like the guy saying, like, if I think about it, I'd blow my brains out. Like, almost realizing his corruption and how far he's come from probably his initial want to like actually hold up justice,
right?
And now he's gotten so deep into this that he's just like, no, like this is my life, this is what it is.
Yeah, it's like a moral dilemma now.
So you know, I don't know, I liked that article or that excerpt because of the fact that like it kind of embraced like many facets of what was going on there. So in response to the uproar caused by these two articles, Mayor Lindsay appointed a 5-member panel to investigate accusations of police corruption. That panel is what became known as the Knapp Commission, named after its chairman, Whitman Knapp, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Knapp Commission later. Just wanted to go ahead and like move the story along and just kind of tell the rest of the Serpico story, since he was involved with the Knapp Commission, but he wasn't involved like in the investigation, even though he did like testify before them and stuff like that.
Okay.
I wanted to treat like the actual like Knapp Commission story a little bit
separate. Okay.
So 10 months after the appointment of the Knapp Commission, on the night of February 3rd, 1971, 4 officers, Frank Serpico, Gary Rodman, Arthur Cesari, and Paul Haley, from the Brooklyn North Police Precinct, received a tip that a drug deal was about to take place. 2 policemen, Rodman and Cesari, stayed outside, while the third, Haley, stood in front of the apartment building. Serpico, like depicted in the movie, climbed up the fire escape, entered by the fire escape door, went downstairs, and he listened for a password, and then followed 2 suspects outside that had just made a buy. The police arrested the young suspects and found one had 2 bags of heroin. Haley stayed with the suspects, and Rodman told Serpico, who spoke Spanish, to make a fake purchase attempt using the password he had just heard.
Which is like what happened in the movie, because there were originally a total of 4 officers, including Serpico. The 2 men came out with the heroin. The 3 of them like ambushed them, and Serpico like ran down to meet them because he was watching the buy. And then Serpico was like, I saw them buy, like I saw the buy, I can do it. And so one officer was like, I can stay with the 2 of them, I'll finish booking them. And then the other 2 officers, went up with Serpico to try to, just like in the movie.
Yep. So, Rodman told him, because you speak Spanish, go make a fake purchase attempt to get the drug dealers to open the door. So the police went to the 3rd floor landing. Serpico knocked on the door, keeping his hand on his revolver. The door opened a few inches, just far enough to wedge his body in, and Serpico called for help, but the fellow officers ignored him. Serpico was shot in the face by the suspect using a small caliber pistol. It was a .22.
Nice.
The bullet struck just below the eye, lodging at the top of his jaw. He fired back before falling to the floor, at which time he began to just like bleed everywhere. His police colleagues, this wasn't shown in the movie, but they refused to make a 1013 dispatch to police headquarters, which is the dispatch indicating that a police officer had been shot.
Oh, really?
So, an elderly man who lived in the next apartment called the emergency services, reporting that the man had been shot and stayed with Serpico.
Holy cow. So, like, if it hadn't been for that guy, like...
he probably would have just laid there.
Oh, shit. Wow.
So, when a police car arrived, aware that Serpico was a fellow officer, they transported him in the patrol car to Greenpoint Hospital. The bullet had severed an auditory nerve, leaving him deaf in one ear, and he has since suffered from chronic pain from bullet fragments still lodged in his brain.
And that was one thing they did talk about in the movie that I didn't cover. I almost did. I should have. But yeah, the doctor was like talking to Serpico and said, you're probably never going to regain hearing in your left ear. You're going to have bullet fragments that'll be lodged in your skull, like basically that you'll have to live with. And yeah.
Which, you and I talked about before, just when you get shot with a smaller caliber, like it sometimes doesn't have the velocity to leave, so it just kind of like bounces around in there, and it
can
almost
damage.
be more dangerous than a higher caliber. Yeah,
it's crazy.
So let's see. He was visited the day after the shooting by Mayor Lindsay and Police Commissioner Murphy, and the police department harassed him with hourly bed checks.
So real quick question. So the commissioner's name was not Delaney. It was
Murphy.
Okay.
Patrick V. Murphy.
Okay.
And then he later testified before the Knapp Commission. The circumstances surrounding Serpico's shooting quickly came into question. Serpico, who was armed during the drug raid, had been shot only after briefly turning away from the suspect when he realized that the 2 officers who had accompanied him to the scene were not following him into the apartment, raising the question whether Serpico had actually been brought to the apartment by his colleagues to be murdered. And however, there was no formal investigation, which in the movie is exactly how it's portrayed too, because he doesn't get shot until he turns to look back around to say, hey, are you guys coming?
Right. Like, what are you waiting for?
Right. Which also may have saved his life, because he got shot in the side of the face. If he had been looking straight in, he may have been shot right between the eyes.
Right.
So,
interesting.
Not to say that maybe it was a blessing in disguise that they brought you to be murdered, but you know,
could have been a lot worse. Maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So on May 3rd, 1971, New York Metro Magazine published an article about Serpico called "Portrait of an Honest Cop." On May 10th, 1971, he testified at the departmental trial of an NYPD lieutenant who was accused of taking bribes from gamblers. And months later, in October and again in December 1971, Serpico testified before the Knapp Commission. So he actually testified twice, which I found interesting, because in the movie it only kind of shows that one time.
Yeah.
Which, I guess it doesn't really make sense for him to testify twice, but, like in the movie, it would be a bit redundant into a movie that's already over the 120
2 hours and 10 minutes.
So part of that testimony, thank you. Jesus Christ.
Testimony?
Was, and I don't remember exactly what was said in the movie, but this sounded very similar, so I'm thinking that maybe they used the same thing in the movie. It says, through my appearance here today, I hope that police officers in the future will not experience the same frustration and anxiety that I was subjected to. For the past 5 years, at the hands of my superiors, because of my attempt to report corruption, I was made to feel that I had burdened them with an unwanted task. The problem is that the atmosphere does not yet exist in which an honest police officer can act, without fear or ridicule or reprisal from fellow officers. Police corruption cannot exist unless it is at least tolerated at higher levels in the department. Therefore, the most important result that can come from these hearings is a conviction by police officers that the department will change. In order to ensure this, an independent, permanent investigative body dealing with police corruption like this commission is essential.
Yep, I think that was the exact quote in the movie. So that's cool.
Yeah.
Because I was wondering about that.
Which is, I thought was like very... Like, not to say that Serpico was at all immature, but I thought that the statement itself was more mature and realist in the fact that he wasn't looking to abolish all corruption, because that's a almost impossible task to take. He was saying, what is needed is someone who does investigate corruption on a regular basis. He wanted a more realistic goal in mind of somebody who is there fighting this thing, as opposed to the one hope that one day there will be world peace and everybody will have food to eat.
That's fair. Yeah.
So, anyway, Serpico retired on June 15th, 1972, just 1 month after receiving the Medal of Honor, the NYPD's highest honor, which I found of note that there was no ceremony to present this award.
Okay.
In fact, Serpico said it was almost slid across his desk to him like a pack of cigarettes.
Really?
Yeah. After his retirement, he moved to Switzerland, where he lived for a decade. It says, to this day, Frank Serpico still speaks out about police brutality to this day.
Cool.
Then there was a little quote. It says, a policeman's first obligation is to be responsible to the needs of the community he serves. The problem is that the atmosphere does not yet exist in which an honest police officer can act without fear or ridicule or reprisal from fellow officers. We create an atmosphere in which the honest officer fears the dishonest officer and not the other way around.
Wow. Nice.
So, yeah, that's all I had as far as like the true story goes. Like I said, I've got a little snippet here from the Knapp Commission that I'd like to go over, if you're okay with that.
Yes, please do.
So the Knapp Commission was formed in 1970. It had 5 members: Whitman Knapp, who was the chair, who it was named after, Arnold Baumann, Franklin A. Thomas, Cyrus Vance, and Joseph Montserrat. While the Knapp Commission began its investigation of corruption in the police department in June 1970, they didn't start any public hearings over a year later until October 1971. So I guess maybe during that time they were like just looking into things or seeing like kind of maybe developing a plan. Mm-hmm. In addition to the testimony of, it says lamplighters here. I found this phrase or this term a few times. Frank Serpico didn't like referring to himself or other people like him as whistleblowers.
Okay.
He liked calling them lamplighters in the, like, I guess sort of a toss up to like Paul Revere. As in, they're like lighting a lamp for you to like see the way, things like that.
Okay.
And so it says, in addition to the testimonies of Serpico and Dirk, testimony from dozens of other witnesses, including former police commissioner Howard Leary, corrupt patrolmen, and the victims of police shakedowns were heard. From 70 to 72, Michael F. Armstrong was chief counsel to the Knapp Commission. As an immediate result of the testimony of the witnesses, criminal indictments against corrupt police officials were handed down. Commissioner Patrick Murphy was appointed by Mayor Lindsay shortly after the commission was formed to clean up the department, implement proactive integrity checks, transfer senior personnel on a huge scale, rotate critical jobs, ensure sufficient funds to pay informants, and crack down on citizen attempts at bribery. And then it says on June 15, 1972, Whitman Knapp, chairman of the Knapp Commission, was nominated as a federal judge for the Southern District of New York by President Richard Nixon. I have here, it's recommendations that were made by the Knapp Commission in light of everything.
Okay.
Since the commission issued its preliminary report on August 15th, 1972, and issued its final report on December 27th, 1972, which was just months after Serpico had retired. And just months before this movie came out. In its final report, the commission found widespread corruption in the New York City Police Department and made the following recommendations. 1, commanders should be held accountable for their subordinates' actions. So turning a blind eye was no longer an acceptable thing.
Right, like many times we saw in the movie.
Right. Commanders should file periodic reports on key aspects that would breed corruption. So I assume this kind of meant like big narcotics things going on in the area, or maybe if they noticed that there was they were hearing a lot about big narcotics things going on, but there wasn't an upswing in arrests or something like that.
Okay.
Like trends like that would show maybe there's something going on.
Okay.
Field offices of the Internal Affairs Division should be created at all precincts. So putting an IAD room in every house. Undercover informants should be placed in all precincts. Improve screening and selection methods and standards for police officers. And a change in police attitudes.
Kind of a broad...
Right. So just blanket. You know? And then this is the point that I was going to make earlier about people who were just kind of roped into it, and as opposed to those that were willing to kill for it. The Knapp Commission report on police corruption identified 2 particular classes of corrupt police officer, which it called grass eaters and meat eaters. Okay? So you've got your vegetarians, you got carnivores. The classification referred to petty corruption under peer pressure as eating grass, and aggressive premeditated major corruption as eating meat.
Okay.
So the term grass eaters is used to describe police officers who accept gratuities and solicit $5, $10, $20 payments from contractors, tow truck drivers, gamblers, and the like, but do not pursue corruption payments. Grass eating is something that a significant number of officers are guilty of, but which they learn to do from other cops or from imitating the deviants they watch and investigate every day. The commission even included that grass eating was used by police officers in New York City to prove their loyalty to the Brotherhood, and with that came incentives like side jobs. One method of preventing cops from becoming corrupt is to eliminate this step by removing veteran cops who do this. Without any veteran cops to learn this from, new officers might decide to never eat grass. And then meat eaters are officers who spend a good deal of time aggressively looking for situations they can exploit for financial gain. An example of this is shaking down pimps and illicit drug dealers for money, not only for the material profit to the officers, but for the relief from guilt that the officers derive by convincing themselves that their victims deserve such treatment. They justify taking advantage of these kinds of criminals because they are considered the dregs of society.
Okay.
So, I don't know. I found that interesting that they, were able to, take a step back and look at, yes, all police corruption is wrong. However, are we dealing with just one type of, corruption here, or, is it a more diverse sort of crowd? Yeah,
definitely. Because, I kind of wondered about that because when Serpico was talking to the other plainclothes officers, and he kind of finally said, all right, I'll take some money for my quote expenses, which I don't know if he ever actually did take any money, but it just kind of made me wonder about the other officers who didn't want to be put in that position of, because they put on a lot of pressure, you look really fishy, this looks really bad for the department. I could see other officers easily being guilted into, just take the money.
Well, that's the whole thing of, if you robbed the bank with somebody and one of the people there was like, oh no, I was just here for the experience, I don't want any money or anything like that. I don't want anything that ties me to the crime. These officers not taking money was almost like they could turn around and say something because they weren't involved in it. However, if they took the money, they were just as culpable as you.
Right.
So a lot of times I felt like maybe they were guilted in just because they wanted to be like, they're like, oh, hey, Steve took some money. It's like, well, you did too, Jim. Fuck you.
Yeah. And that was another thing in the movie they didn't really talk about. At one point, Lombardo, I think it was when Lombardo was talking to his chief and, letting him know, hey, we found out about all this corruption in the department, all these bribes that are being taken. He said, I think if there was an attitude of more support in the department, so many more officers would come forward. But if we don't support it, then no one's going to step forward unless there's encouragement to step forward. And I kind of think you're right. Like this, pressuring them into taking the money is kind of a way it's almost security too for the other officers who are taking money. Like if we can pressure them into taking some of the money, well, then they're not going to speak out against us because they're just as guilty.
Yeah, and it's easier to sleep at night if you don't have to worry about maybe the guy next to you is, going to turn you in.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Because at that point, it's what your word as a police officer versus a criminal's word. Yeah. And only you know that you're as dirty as you are. So that's all I really had for Serpico.
Cool.
In my searching for Serpico, I did stumble upon another officer for the New York Police Department that I got a little bit of a story on if anybody wants to hang around and listen to. It's interesting. It's short. I won't take up much of your time, but it just goes to show that, there is still corruption. This happened in the late 2000s. So, we are talking like 35 years later, and still stuff going on. And this actually goes to what you were talking about as far as like the quotas and stuff earlier.
Okay.
So there was an officer named Adrian Schoolcraft who is actually from Killeen, Texas. He was born in 1976. He's a former New York City Police Department detective officer who secretly recorded police conversations from 2008 to 2009. It said that he started recording his everyday conversations. That way, when suspects or criminals like called him on things, like he was able to like pull up these tapes. And then he started witnessing things with other police officers, so he just recorded all the time.
So he was just recording on his own accord.
Right. He didn't start recording because he was noticing corruption. It was just something he, I guess, started collecting.
Okay. And that was one thing in the movie. Not that this is like the Serpico story, obviously, because this is way after. But Serpico, at one point, they did show him like recording a phone conversation with, it was either like Bob Blair or like Captain McLean or something like that. But yeah, he just had like a tape recorder in his house and he just like would record it whenever he was on the phone with them. Like, yeah, just to have. But I mean, it never came up again in the movie. So, yeah. But anyway, sorry, go on.
So, like I said, he recorded conversations from 2008 to 2009. He brought these tapes to NYPD investigators in October 2009 as evidence of corruption and wrongdoing within the department. He used the tapes as evidence that arrest quotas were leading to police abuses, such as wrongful arrest, while the emphasis on fighting crime sometimes resulted in underreporting of crimes to keep the numbers down. So basically, like, they were held to certain quotas, so they were almost manufacturing certain things, but when it came to like taking on real crimes, they had to keep a certain percentage, so they didn't report a lot of crime because of that.
I'm sure their quotas increased, like if they were like if there was more criminal activity in their precinct or whatever, then they had to have more quotas. But if they said, our criminal activity isn't that high, then their quotas aren't that high, and then there's like less numbers they have to fudge.
Right. So an example of how the overemphasis on arrests led to wrongful arrests and bad police work, a recording of his from October 31st, 2009 includes Precinct Commander Stephen Moriello ordering a raid on 120 Chauncey Street. I don't know what's there. I'm just, it says, or he said, "Everybody goes. I don't care. You're on 120 Chauncey and they're popping champagne. Yoke 'em. Put them through the system. They got bandanas on. Arrest them. Everybody goes tonight. They're underage. Fuck it. Bring them in. Lodge them. You're going to go back out there and process it later on." So basically, whether they're doing wrong or not, right, they're simply in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Shit.
Schoolcraft reported being harassed. There was also something I read as far as like stop and frisks, stop and search, something like that.
Okay.
Where they would just see somebody on the side of the road and then stop them and search them. Apparently that the percentage of stop and frisk went up like significantly because of these quotas, where they were just hoping that they would find somebody with a weapon or drugs or whatever the case.
Just some reason to arrest them.
Yeah, I mean, they had a quota to fill, so they were just like, oh, I don't like the way you look, let's stop you. So Schoolcraft reports being harassed, particularly in 2009, after he began to voice his concerns within the precinct. He was told he needed to increase arrest numbers and received a bad evaluation. The next day, he found a paper in his locker reading, "If you don't like your job, maybe you should get another one."
Shit.
In October 2009, Schoolcraft disclosed his allegations to the New York Police Department investigators in a meeting that he understood was to be confidential. He discussed underreporting of crimes and bureaucratic hassles for people who tried to report crimes. So his father contacted David Dirk,
Oh, nice.
a retired detective who became famous working on similar issues of corruption with Frank Serpico. Dirk contacted an officer in NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau. After voicing his concerns, Schoolcraft was continually harassed and reassigned to a desk job. So after he left work early one day, an NYPD emergency services unit illegally entered his apartment, physically abducted him, and forcibly admitted him to a psychiatric facility where he was held against his will for 6 days.
Holy shit.
So I looked into like events from that night, and it seems that somehow, I guess David Dirk found out and called the guy's dad, and his dad called him like, "Hey, you need to, like, something's going on." And he looked out his like apartment.
Like before this even happened?
Right. He looked out his apartment window and saw like police amassing.
Holy shit.
Okay. And apparently there were some higher up police officers involved and stuff. So like his dad stayed on the phone, and then he turned on 2 tape recorders, one of which was found by the police department and destroyed. The other one they didn't find. But showing them like they just burst in the door, and then they were asking, they're like, "Hey, have you not heard us knocking here? We've been knocking for like forever."
And they weren't knocking.
They weren't knocking at all. And like all these different things trying to make him seem like crazy.
Okay.
And then like convinced him that, you know, hey, they need to take him to the hospital, and like that he need to go for high blood pressure or something like that. And yeah, it's a wild story. And then, 6 days later, his dad was finally able to like find out where he was and get him out of the hospital.
Wow.
But it was just kind of crazy, you know. It's like, you know, it's not the same corruption that was happening back when Serpico was there, but it's still a form of, you know, corruption.
Well, like that whole quote that Serpico had from the Knapp Commission was like, if only like the biggest thing that needs to come out of this is like changes to the police department so that no other officer has to feel the frustration or anxiety I felt for having to try to report corruption. And I feel like it's really sad that like 30 some years later, it's an officer still can't do it. Like, I don't know if any changes come of it since this story, but I mean, it literally sounds like he was going through some of the things Serpico was going through. You know, he saw this corruption, he saw something that wasn't right, he tried reporting it, and he got like the abuse and the intimidation that Serpico went through. And it's like, you're right, it's not the same corruption, it's a different thing, but he still can't feel comfortable going to superiors and saying, "Hey, this isn't right, something needs to change." And
right, I mean, to the point that, you know, he thought he was in a like classified meeting or a secret meeting, and then all of a sudden, like, no, we're going to, like, you're showing, and you see the police, like report from the hospital saying that he was like of sane mind and things like that, but had
that's like crazy to a whole nother level too, from like the Serpico story, like being told that like you are like making to be felt like you're insane. Like, how shitty is that?
Right. And that's part of the whole thing was, you know, the report from the hospital said like he was a sane in mind, but he was like showing paranormal like tendencies of like paranoia and like creating things in his mind and stuff like that. And it's like, you know, he's sitting there trying to like say, I'm sure like this is what's going on, but like the hospital's going off of what the police are saying, you know. It's just wild. It's scary. And then I found out after this that the Village Voice reported that there was a 2010 unpublished report involving this whole thing, all this, you know, what he was trying to uncover, and that it was in the 81st precinct.
Oh, shit.
Which is the precinct that
Serpico started
in. Yeah. So that's why I wanted, you know, there was a lot of like tie-ins with David Dirk and the 81st precinct and the fact that it was corruption. And, yeah, that's why I kind of wanted to like tag it on to the story we were doing.
Okay, so like, has anything come from it? Like, nothing? Like, is this guy still a police officer?
No. He's not a police officer.
Poor guy.
He quit.
Yeah, I would
think
too.
He moved back to
Fuck
like
that.
Texas or something. Like he had moved up to New York because like that's where his parents lived, and then his mom got cancer, so he was like driving her to like chemo every day, and then she died, and
Aw,
so yeah, it's just a crazy, crazy ass story.
that's messed up.
So, and I'm sure there's more. I didn't look into a lot of it because of the fact, like in depth, because this was about Serpico, so I didn't want to make it a
Sure.
Adrian Schoolcraft's story. But I thought it was definitely worth mentioning. If anybody is interested, it is a crazy sounding story. You should definitely look into it. There are a couple like documentaries and short movies based on it. So I don't know if we'll get into it. Maybe something in the future will be based on it. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
Wow.
Yeah, lots of different craziness.
Yeah. So after all of that, how do you feel about the Serpico versus true story?
I feel like there was enough in the movie to say that it was pretty accurate. I mean, we definitely don't know a lot of the details on what was going on. Enough names were changed that even if certain circumstances were involved, was he talking to those people in the movie, or was it just a general depiction of what happened in real life?
I think so. From what you had told us of the true story, it sounds like that like final raid on the like drug dealer when he got shot was really accurate. It sounded so. In my opinion, I understand why the first hour and a half of the movie was there. Like it was kind of like, especially in the 70s, like after this was still fresh, just trying to show examples of like what was going on in the police department, like what Serpico's motivation was. But I feel like a lot of the stuff in the first hour and a half of the movie could have been trimmed, could have been cut back. And if the focus had been on the final, like what happened to Serpico and the Knapp Commission and all that, I feel like it could have been a good movie.
In light of trying to like go back into a director's mind and give them more credit than they originally had, maybe the first half was like slow and disjointed because that's the way that Serpico felt in his attempt to fight this corruption. Like I said, I really don't think that that's the case, but you can look back at it in that sense because of the fact that, we've read and seen like all the attempts he made to do this, and maybe he felt like he was pounding his head against the wall, and that's what Sidney Lumet wanted us to know. What does it feel? Was that head pounding against the wall?
Yeah, that's how I felt for the first hour and a half of the movie. Was I was just pounding my head against the wall.
Every scene was like, I'm pulling teeth again, and then shit just started happening, and it is a lot like the actual story where it seems like he had all this time trying to show people this is what's going on, and then all of a sudden, like shit happened quick. But yeah, I do feel like it's a pretty accurate movie as far as like depicting the story. Whether the actual events in the movie are the actual events that happened in real life, who's to say? But there's enough from the articles I read in the Times to say that, to show that there were general depictions of it in the movie.
Yeah.
So
I would agree.
I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, I'm pleasantly surprised at how accurate it is. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
that's Serpico, everybody.
that's Serpico. Glad to be back and talking to you guys again.
Yeah.
Glad to be sharing our thoughts and opinions. If you want to share your thoughts and opinions with us, please reach out to us at drinktofact@gmail.com.
You can also find us on social media, on Facebook at Drink to Fact, Instagram at Drink to Fact, Twitter at Drink to Fact.
Yep. You can listen to us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play,
YouTube,
Podbean. I'm sure we're missing one. Anywhere you find your favorite podcast. If we're not on there, let us know, and we'll find a way to get on there. Thank you again for listening, guys. We missed you. Gals also, sorry. As always.
Rate, review, and subscribe.
And we'll see you again next week.
Cheers.